This is Newsroom. Hello and welcome from Johannesburg in South Africa. I'm Eben Jansen. The show, of course, live and broadcast from our studios in Auckland Park. We're also streaming live on YouTube right now with the whole show available on our YouTube channel on demand. On the show today, marches in South Africa and around the world seems to be gaining momentum against the conflict in Gaza. Former Intelligence Minister Sir Ronnie Kasrils joins us today to give us his views. And then also Professor Stephen Friedman joins us. Give us some views on this topic, but also talk about others in the news. Later, we'll look at corporal punishment in schools and a case that saw a young learner lose her life recently. First, though, Katrine gives us the news headlines.
Well, morning and welcome to Newsroom. I'm Katrine Malan, and let's take a look at the top stories this morning. Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa will be answering some tough questions today at the Marikana Commission of Inquiry on whether he should be among those held accountable for the Marikana killings. Ramaphosa was a Lonmin shareholder when 44 people died during strike-related violence at Lonmin's platinum mining operations at Marikana in August 2012.
What I was dealing with was a situation that I saw as being very, very dangerous. 10 people had died, and I was concerned about further loss of life. And by no stretch of anybody's imagination could I ever have said, deal with the people who finally died.
Former crime intelligence boss Richard Mdluli is expected to appear in the Palm Ridge Magistrates Court today. Mdluli had fraud and corruption charges reinstated against him earlier this year after the Supreme Court of Appeal upheld a High Court ruling against the withdrawal of the charges. Mdluli was originally suspended amid allegations of fraud and corruption and charges relating to the murder of his ex-lover's husband in 1999. The World Health Organization is expected to call together experts from around the world to discuss the ethical issues of providing experimental treatment to people suffering from Ebola. The organization says clinical trials of vaccines are set to get underway shortly. There is currently no available cure or vaccine for Ebola. Meanwhile, Guinea closed its borders with Sierra Leone and Liberia on Saturday in a bid to halt the spread of the epidemic that has killed nearly 1,000 people in the three countries this year. A new 72-hour ceasefire has come into effect in the Gaza Strip, raising hopes for a fresh respite in bloody conflict between Israel and Hamas. Israel will send negotiators to the Egyptian capital today if the truce holds. Egypt has called on both sides to use the lull to reach a comprehensive and more permanent ceasefire. And the Proteas will resume day 3 in the first and only test match against Zimbabwe on 201 for 4. The Zimbabweans were bowled out for 256 in the first session of day 2. Having gone into the match with predictions of victory within 3 days, the visitors now face the challenge of not earning a commanding lead. Remember, all these top stories are available on Newsroom Facebook page. You can also follow us on Twitter at SABC Newsroom. Eben, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Katrine. Now, tens of thousands of people calling for an end to the bloodshed in the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict marched to Parliament in Cape Town on Saturday in one of the biggest rallies the city has seen in more than 20 years. In Manhattan, in New York City, a similar scene was set on the same day as Palestinian supporters lined the streets of Manhattan, marching to the United Nations and shouting that Israel's response to missile attacks was genocide that took children's lives. Similar rallies took place in France, Britain, Australia, India, Ireland and Norway over the weekend. Truly a global outcry that seems to be falling on deaf ears. According to reports, more than 1,900 people have been killed since Israel launched Operation Protective Edge against Gaza a month ago. It leaves us with the tiresome question, are these cries around the world leading us somewhere? Are they being heard, and when will it come to an end? Now, to further this discussion, we are joined this morning by former Minister of Intelligence in South Africa and anti-apartheid activist, Mr. Ronnie Kasrils. Good morning to you, sir. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
This weekend we saw the largest pro-Palestinian march protest in Cape Town, many more happening around the world. What are your views on these marches, and are we seeing a groundswell happening?
Yes, I think definitely. People all over the world are absolutely and utterly outraged at the way Israel attacks the Palestinians, West Bank, Gaza, 4 times in the last 6-8 years or so, the attack on Lebanon in 2006. And this groundswell is increasing all the time. That march in Cape Town, well over 100,000 people, is probably the biggest march we've seen in South Africa's history, by the way. And what is happening is that people everywhere are getting behind the position of isolating Israel, applying boycott, divestment and sanctions. It's spreading and it's bringing pressure on governments. 6 Latin American countries have at the moment sent the ambassadors of Israel packing, and in the case of Chile are cutting down on trade. We saw with apartheid, South Africa, how that groundswell of international solidarity became a very important instrument for solidarity and support for a struggling people and pressure on governments. And there's pressure on our South African government, which should be showing the way with regard to boycott, divestment and sanctions. That is going to increase. So I applaud this, and I'm absolutely so happy about it.
I wanted to ask you about these kinds of marches. Last month we saw in France one of these marches turn violent, and there always seems to be this kind of edge to it. What are your views on it? I know you were at this march in Paris.
Yes.
Francois Hollande said that we must be careful not to import this kind of violence into our countries. Does that apply to South Africa? And do you think that this is a war that is being fought across the world in every community already?
Well, where's it been imported into South Africa? We don't see violence. We don't see attacks on the Jewish community. Yes, there's outrage. Yes, there might be some people who stupidly raise a kind of anti-Semitic statement or so. We've seen that even from some ANC people. It's immediately come down on. There's no such exportation of violence. There are anti-Semitic elements all over the world who would take advantage. But I want to tell you something about where the source of this violence is, because I had first-hand experience in France. I was in Paris for that demonstration. Incidentally, it was called, amongst others, by a Jewish group, which is also very important in what we saw in Cape Town, because it's uniting people, it's not dividing people, Muslims, Christian, Jews, etc. What happened a week before this particular demonstration of Paris, there was an earlier one, and something called the Jewish Defense League. They are banned as terrorists in the United States. They allowed in France, and they are absolute hoodlums and thugs. They attacked a peaceful demonstration, and young people responded by attempting to deal with them. They hid behind the police lines. That was the violence. So it's this extreme element of that kind. And I would say, I know there are extremists all over, but I would say let's focus in on the Israel situation, the Palestinian situation. Israel is responsible for state terrorism. It's got its groups, such as the one I've referred to, although that group's banned in Israel. But there are these hooligans there, and the Israeli government is becoming increasingly right-wing extremist. Netanyahu and his cohorts show that. So let's keep that in mind in terms of what's taking place. Demonstrations are overwhelmingly peaceful, disciplined. We've seen that in our country. And I hail those Jewish people who have involved themselves. That's the way to deal with anti-Semitic sentiments, because the rest of our people see that it's not simply a question of if you're opposed to Israel and its policies, that's anti-Semitic. It is absolutely not.
We see at these marches there seems to be an increasing thought process around Jewish, not Zionist. Can you just maybe qualify that statement by marches that you've interacted, what that means and what that means to you?
Well, Zionism is a doctrine, and Zionism comes from 19th century movement of looking for a homeland for Jews, seeking that way out in relation to anti-Semitism. At that stage, and even later in this country, there were Jewish groups who were socialist inclined, and they were the ones who initially debated heatedly with the Zionists and were absolutely hated by them and were attacked by them. So the question of Zionism, and Stephen Friedland is coming on soon, he's a great expert in that. But yes, I'm born Jewish, and I was affected by this in terms of the community I grew up in. But I can tell you that growing up in South Africa gave me another identity. And that's identity of the country that I'm born in. And the question of dealing with something like anti-Semitism or any ethnic group, you deal with it through becoming part of the popular democratic movement of your country in order to ensure that all people are treated equally.
Finally, Mr. Caswell, you mentioned earlier about South American countries withdrawing their ambassadors and so forth. During the US-Africa summit last week, our president said that this might be a counterproductive step at this stage. What are your views on recalling the Israeli ambassador from South Africa?
You see, I'd say to Jacob Zuma and to the ruling party, ANC, that as in our struggle, we never said to the world, deal with apartheid and with the ANC on an even-handed basis. I mean, that is nonsense. There is people who are struggling for justice, and those who repress. Repression, incidentally, as we know, gives rise to resistance. And as the ANC, we welcomed governments breaking off ties, supporting BDS, boycott, divestment and sanctions, as a way of bringing about change.
Yeah.
The ANC and our president should be leading this process internationally, not coming up with mealy-mouthed statements such as he did. That is absolutely immoral and wrong. And it defies what Mandela has said about our need for solidarity with the Palestinians. It's not an even-handed thing. We must choose sides for justice, for a proper solution, for all the people's security. But that question, Israelis, Palestinians, Jews, Muslims, Christians there need to resolve themselves without the kind of support that Israel gets from the United States and other countries, which means that Israel conducts itself and its murders with impunity. South Africa must take the lead in this respect.
Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Former Intelligence Minister, Mr. Ronnie Caswell, also a well-known anti-apartheid activist, actually one of the pillars of the anti-apartheid struggle. We're going to take a short break. We'll be back with Newsroom right after this.
BMW M4 Coupe. One with the machine.
Welcome back. This is Newsroom on SABC News now. Paulo Jordan, a man regarded as one of South Africa's foremost intellectuals and an ANC stalwart, came under intense media scrutiny recently when a Sunday Times investigation revealed that he has no formal academic qualifications, in spite of numerous mentions of a doctorate from a university in the United Kingdom. Jordan is widely regarded inside and outside academic circles as a leading intellectual. The incident unlocked much debate about academics versus intellectuals, qualifications versus experience. Today, joining us is political analyst Professor Stephen Friedman to continue this discussion. But before we carry on with this discussion, I'm sure you listened to the interview I did with Ronnie Caswell a little bit earlier. What are your views on the marches happening around the world, but the violence continuing in Gaza?
Well, I think to look at it from a political point of view, the reality is that the violence will only stop when there is far more peaceful pressure on the Israeli government. I guess the real question to ask about these protests we've been seeing is, will it lead to concrete action? And I think over time it will. I mean, to me, something very interesting, if you look at Britain at the moment, you have members of the Conservative government saying that they think there ought to be a military embargo. You have various European countries taking the same attitude. Of course, right now the United States remains very firmly behind the Israeli state. But I think the thing to look for as we go forward is, does this lead to concrete actions to push the Israeli state to the negotiating table?
Quickly, you heard the criticism that was levelled against the South African government for not recalling its ambassador. What do you think that would be an effective tool in the fight against, or the fight for peace, rather?
I've been a little puzzled by the emphasis on recalling the ambassador. Look, I don't think in reality it's going to happen. But the important point is, what you really want at this stage is pressure on the Israeli government to negotiate. You're far more likely to get that with a consumer boycott or pressure on companies to disinvest than you are with withdrawing ambassadors. So I think the real action, if you like, is going to be various consumer boycotts have been called. People have been called upon not to buy Israeli goods as a sign of protest. I think as that begins to build around the world, you'll see this conflict shift.
I want to move on to last week, the whole hullabaloo, furore that broke out around Dr. Paulo Jordan and his credentials, as it were. You were the one person who on Facebook wrote a very interesting piece on the matter. Just run us quickly through your thoughts on that.
Well, I think the problem with this issue and a lot of issues in our country, we've developed a culture in this country where if somebody, a public figure in government or vaguely connected with government, gets accused of something, what you're expected to do as a commentator is you're supposed to join the lynch mob. You're supposed to yell at the person without trying to analyze what's going on. I think my job's an analyst, not a member of a lynch mob.
Yeah.
I never said it's a good idea to say you have a doctorate when you don't. I never said it's a bad idea for newspapers to report on that. What I did say was that whether Paulo Jordan has a doctorate or not has nothing to do, in my view, with whether he's a top intellectual or not. I've had the pleasure in a book of mine, which is coming out soon, to have extended correspondence with Paulo Jordan. He is an outstanding intellectual. If he did something which he shouldn't have done, that needs to be dealt with in the public debate, but it doesn't change his ability as an intellectual.
Can we afford to lose a stalwart like Paulo Jordan out of the South African discourse?
Well, no, we can't. We can't, and I don't think we will, because it's not the equivalent issue. But just to give you an interesting parallel about the point that what a person may or may not have done has got nothing to do with their ability as an intellectual. Herman Charles Bosman is revered in this country as an author. Bosman went to jail for killing his brother. Now, the fact that he went to jail for killing his brother doesn't mean that his books aren't brilliant. If Paulo Jordan did lie about the doctorate, it doesn't mean that his intellectual work isn't brilliant. It is brilliant, and we can't afford to lose those sorts of voices from our national debate.
Finally, are we obsessed with qualifications in South Africa?
Yes, we are obsessed with qualifications. They're important in some respect. I wouldn't like to be treated by a doctor who doesn't have a medical degree. I wouldn't like my books done by an accountant who doesn't have an accountancy degree. But if you look at public positions and you look at the public debate, qualifications are not essential. The question is, do you have the ability, not do you have the piece of paper?
Professor, thank you very much for joining us today. It seems that we are going to take a live feed now. It seems as if Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa is about to do, or have just taken the stand at the Marikana Commission, where he'll be giving evidence, of course, about that fateful day when 34 miners died on the 16th of August, which will be commemorated 2 years this week. Let's go to the Marikana Commission of Inquiry.
I considered it grave because in her communication to me, she had already indicated that 2 people had been injured or shot at. So to me, that raised a concern that an element of violence was beginning to creep into this action, but I also felt that it is a grave situation because the differential between rock drill operators at Lonmin and the other mines was different, was quite big, and I knew that that would be a huge issue of concern to the rock drill operators at Lonmin.
Yes, and indeed you articulate that in your email where you say, the problem with the situation is that we know the cause of it. The real cause is the huge differential between the wages paid to the rock drill operators in other companies and what we pay them. I really did not know that the differential was so huge.
Yeah.
The solution they've come up with is clearly not workable. Now, the solution that had been referenced in the letter is the special bonus, and I'm not surprised that the rock drill operators have rejected it. Why did you consider the bonus an inadequate response?
I considered it an inadequate response because she had communicated to me the differential as she represented it then, and I knew that rock drill operators do communicate with each other across the various companies that they work for, and there would ordinarily be a going rate for the pay levels of rock drill operators because they basically do the same type of work.
Yes.
So if there was a differential, it would be a problem.
Now, on the next page, if I could take you to it, is actually page 3 of this exhibit. We see that there is the memorandum that is referenced in the emails,
yes.
And there is an account that is given here of a sequence of events. Did you have regard to this memorandum at the time?
No, I did not.
I see. Well, it sets out certain events as understood by Lonmin management at the time, but the record of that is just set out, and we don't need to take that further. If I could then refer you to what is page 5 in my bundle, but Mr. Chairman, I'm not certain that I haven't now gone on to another exhibit. It's the email of the 12th of August from Mr. Jamison to Mr. Ramaphosa.
I understand from Ms. Pillay that's not previously been handed in. So that will be quadruple J2.
So if I could then refer you to this particular document, which is an email from Mr. Jamison, and it's headed "Unrest at Marikana Mines." Who is Mr. Jamison?
Mr. Jamison
Was he at that stage, at any rate?
At that stage, Mr. Jamison was the marketing director of Lonmin, and in this particular case, the then CEO had taken ill, and he was, if you like, doubling up for the CEO and in communicating to me.
Now, he writes this on the 12th of August, which is a Sunday, and if we could just go to the contents of that email. It's written to the Director General, but then copies, as you will see, are sent to you. And perhaps we could just go to the text of the email that Mr. Jamison sent to the Director General. He says, "Dear DG, sorry to interrupt your Sunday. We have a terrible and distressing situation at our Marikana operations with 2 people killed in violence. Ian Farmer was off sick in the latter part of last week, hence my communique to you and request to please keep the Minister updated. I'm concentrating more on speed of communication to you here, and I'm unsure of complete accuracy, but I promise to get a full and accurate account to you by letter tomorrow." And then he goes on to say and recount the events. He says, "On Friday morning we became aware of an illegal work stoppage across all our mines by mainly the RDOs. Approximately 90% did not report for work. seeking to escalate a pay issue directly with management. There was an illegal gathering of some few thousand workers, followed by an unauthorized march. Apart from the usual boisterous spirits, this passed off largely peacefully, and the gathering dispersed. We did, however, obtain an urgent court interdict by Friday afternoon and issued, unfortunately my copies are so poor, them with a briefing informing them that the gathering, their actions were illegal and could result in disciplinary action and dismissal. We informed and cooperated fully with the local police and the local mayor to appraise them of the situation and urged a strong presence given what had happened. The SAP were present and monitored the gathering and stewarded the marches. From Friday morning, we were also in almost constant contact with local and national NUM and AMCU officers who, whilst not claiming any responsibility for actions, were doing their best to understand the situation and act accordingly. We've done everything possible to work with the SAP in deploying our own presumably security, by comparison somewhat modest security details to try to ensure the safety and security of those wishing to report to work. Then he goes on to say, on Friday night shift, there were instances of employees not reporting to work, and by Saturday morning it was clear the stoppage by the rock drill operators was continuing. During the course of yesterday, last night and this morning, there were sporadic violent incidents, including a reportedly well-organized attack by a mob of hundreds on police and our security, which resulted in the death of two of our own security officers when their patrol car was burned and an NUM office torched. We were in the process of informing their families of this tragedy. Attacks and disruptions are continuing, and the situation can neither be described as stable nor under control. We continue to be in contact and work with the SAP and the two unions. And then there is a note to Tibedi. At this stage, it is clear that probably only a massive police and possibly army presence will stop us having a repeat of recent past experiences on nearby. We simply do not have the capability to protect life and limb, and I urge you please to use your influence to bring this over to the necessary officials who have the resources at their disposal. We need help. Now, did you receive this email?
Yes, I did receive this email, as it was copied to me as well.
Yes. And you'll see that in the communication to you, the note from Mr. Jamieson is absolutely tragic events. I know you're trying to help. Thank you below for your information. And if I could then take you to the next page in this bundle, which is page 7.
It will be quadruple J3.
Now, this is simply a list that we have compiled from phone records of the various phone calls that have been recorded between you and the two ministers, the Minister of Police and the Minister of Minerals and Energy Affairs. Now, could we just go to the first of those entries, well, actually, to be more accurate, the second of those entries, which is recorded to be on Sunday, the 12th of August at 6:38 p.m. You are recorded there to have received a call from the Minister of Police. Did you receive such a call?
Yes, I did receive such a call.
Could you tell us what transpired in the conversation that you had with the Minister of Police?
After having read this email from Mr. Jamieson, I felt it was necessary to respond to the concern that he was raising in his email, particularly in relation to the people who had either been injured or had been killed. And I realized that he was concerned that this could escalate into more violence and more deaths, like, as he says in his email, happened in other mines. And I remembered for a fact that in another mine at Impala, a number of people had died in similar circumstances where there was labor action. And I, in my call to him, just raise the concern that Jemison had raised, that people had died and are dying, and the situation was getting worse. And Jemison had requested that there should be more police presence so as to prevent further loss of life. And I said, Minister, the situation that I've been told about on the ground is such that they need help. They need more police presence on the ground. Could he do something about it?
Did you, in that conversation, in any way seek to suggest to the Minister what steps should be taken and what sort of police presence was required?
No, I did not suggest it should be taken. All I communicated to him was the concern that Jemison had raised, and that they needed more help, and police presence on the ground would help.
Yes. And as far as you recall, what was the Minister's response?
The Minister said he would look into it, and he said to me, talk to his people on the ground and see and hear for himself what is actually unfolding.
Yes. Now, when you decided to make this call to the Minister, and he in turn got back to you, and the conversation that you told us about occurred, in what capacity did you make this intervention with the Minister?
As he had communicated what was happening to me, he did so in my capacity as non-executive director.
When you say he,
that is Jemison.
Mr. Jemison.
Mr.
Yes.
Jemison, I apologize.
Yes.
When Mr. Jemison copied this email to me, he did so in my capacity as non-executive director. And I felt that with this grave situation that was unfolding at the mine, I felt duty-bound to try and help and see the extent to which one could communicate with those in authority, as he himself had said in his email, to try and get the situation not to escalate into further violence and loss of life.
Presumably, Mr. Jamison looked to you for assistance in this way because you did have political influence. In what capacity did you have such influence?
He knew that I knew the Minister of Police, and I knew some of the people in authority. And as he needed, as the manager on the ground, assistance, he knew that I could communicate a message to the Minister of Police, which I did.
Yes. Now, if we go to the next document in the bundle, it is page 8 of the bundle.
It's also a new document, so that would be quadruple J4.
It is to be read together with a press release which follows it. I don't know if you want to see them as a single document.
If it's going to be referred to separately, as it may be, let's give it a separate exhibit number. So you're referring to page 9,
Indeed.
which will be quadruple J5.
Now, if we could start with quadruple J5, which in your bundle will be document number 9, one sees that a press release had been issued by Lonmin on the 12th of August 2012. And I don't want to go through all of it, but if we could just pick up a few of the aspects that are reflected in this media release. It begins by saying, Lonmin condemns fatal attacks. 2 Lonmin employees have been killed and 6 injured in 3 incidents of suspected inter-union conflict at the company's Western Platinum operations. The company immediately requested the support of the South African police services to try and contain the violence in support of its own security procedures. The incidents followed an illegal work stoppage and protest march on Friday. The illegal march was accompanied by incidents of intimidation and violent action against employees who wanted to report for duty. 4 employees trying to report to work were injured on Friday the 10th, 2 of whom have been hospitalized after receiving gunshot wounds, allegedly by rival union supporters. A further 2 employees were hospitalized on Saturday, also as a result of gunshot wounds. On Saturday the 12th, 2 Lonmin security guards were killed as a large group attempted to attack Lonmin facilities. Their families, to whom the company extends its deepest sympathies, are being informed. The company will do everything possible to support the SAPS in bringing the culprits to book. At the commencement of the unrest, Lonmin immediately took immediate precautions from a security perspective, including mobilizing additional resources and involving the SAPS. And then there is a statement from Mr. Mokoena that is referenced. Now, if we could go back to quadruple J4, where you are now writing to Mr. Mokoena, and you reference the press statement which I've just referred to, and you, excuse me, and you say this is a grave situation. Now, if I could pause there and ask you again to tell us why was that your estimation of the situation?
The press statement had set out that violence was escalating and workers had been killed and security guards had also been killed, and I concluded that this had now become really grave, and that is what I felt, and that is what I communicated to Bernard Mokoena as well.
Yes. Now, if we read on in the email, it says, as I indicated, I spoke to the Minister of Police again and stressed that they should immediately take steps to ensure that they protect life and property and bring those responsible for the terrible acts of violence and death to book. Now, this suggests that you had a further conversation with the Minister of Police. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, I had said to the Minister that the situation was actually getting worse and more violence was occurring, and this raised the level of my concern even higher, and it is for that reason that I communicated as I did to Barnard, and I told him that I had spoken to the Minister, and I had said that they should take immediate steps to ensure that they protect life and property and also take steps to bring those responsible for these acts to book, because some of the descriptions that were coming through about how the people were killed were quite horrifying.
Did you seek to prescribe in any way to the Minister what steps he should take or what you had in mind?
When I said that they should be brought to book, I had anticipated and expected that those who were responsible would be identified and they would be arrested, which is what I expect police to do normally in pursuing their tasks and duties.
Yes. What about the steps to ensure that property and life is protected? Did you have anything in mind as far as that's concerned?
Yes, it occurred to me that where these incidents had occurred, as one got the full detail thereof, police presence was either absent or very minimal, and that is why I felt these people were being attacked and being killed in the way they were.
Yes. Now, the response that you record here is that the minister said that they were working on it. As far as you can recall, did the minister convey anything more to you other than that?
No, he did not convey anything to me other than that, and he just said they're working on it, they are aware of the unfolding situation.
Yes, now, after you say regards, you then say, let us all keep cool heads. Can you tell us what you had in mind?
What I had in mind was that we should keep our heads cool. We should not be alarmist in what we said, either publicly or otherwise, and that hopefully the situation would be brought under control. And that, to me, is what keeping cool heads meant, because it was what I perceived as the brutality of the killing, particularly of the security guards, that was quite alarming and could have led one to react in ways that could have been too alarmist. And I felt one needed to keep a cool head and hope that the police would prevent further loss of life and injury to other people.
Now, on the same day, the 13th of August, if we go to the next email, which is page number 11 in your bundle, and Chair, I'm imagining this is quadruple J6, but...
Email from Mrs. Kubi, dated the 13th, is it right?
That is so.
That's also a new exhibit, so that will be quadruple J6, as you say.
Now, shortly after the email that we've just examined, quadruple J4, you received an email from Thandeka Ngube, and perhaps we could just, again, briefly refer to its contents. It's sent to a number of people, yourself included, and it says, Lawnman strike update. This morning we had an update, telecon on the strike at Lawnman operations in Marikana. Last night, 2 more Lawnman employees were killed. One was found dead with several bullet holes. The other was shot at the mine. This brings us to a total of 4 dead employees. And then it says, Lawnman has stepped up the call for more SAPS presence, and this morning the police commissioner was at the mine to identify hotspots. She has pledged her full support. There are 2 helicopters flying over the operations and about 150 SAPS staff on the premises. The South African police has promised to increase the number of police on the ground. And then there are some matters concerning the HR process that was being followed in respect of workers facing dismissal. And in that it is said both AMCU and NUM are still denying involvement, but NUM has been supportive with the president of NUM visiting the operations and liaising with both Ministers Shabangu and Mtetwa. The tactics used in the strike are similar to those used at Impala. So AMCU is looking, she says, very suspicious. And then there are some references to the impact on the business. And generally, Albert is preparing letters to the provincial and local government, and he's doing a briefing note to Minister Shabangu and will also send a note to the office of the presidency. From you, as far as you can recall, did anything more happen on the 13th that involved your taking any actions?
No, nothing further that required my taking any action happened on that day.
Yes. Then on the 14th of August, and this is document 12.
It's already an exhibit. It's triple B4.
This is an email that is sent by Roger Phillimore to a number of persons, yourself included. Who is Mr. Phillimore?
Mr. Roger Phillimore was the then chairman of Lonmin PLC.
He writes to you, and he says, I attach a note from Tanya summarizing the current situation at the mine. And then it says that the massive police intervention has had a significant effect, but the challenge will be to sustain it. You will note that efforts are being made to get people back to work over the next few days. Mohammed has very kindly agreed to help in keeping the business running. And then he says, my attempts to speak with the minister have not yet succeeded, but I was able to brief a very supportive Mick Davis. Who is Mick Davis?
Mick Davis was the CEO of Extrata, which was also a shareholder in Lonmin.
Yes. And do you know which minister he is here referring to?
I would have imagined that he was referring to the Minister of Mineral Resources.
Yes. And then he goes on to say, the SA press is all over this, but accurately is focusing attention on government's duty to restore peace and quiet. We are seen as collateral damage. The markets in London have not surprisingly marked the shares down by some 4% today. And if we turn over the page, we'll see the update to which he refers in the first sentence of his email. And it references the fact that the police are now fully engaged since yesterday morning at the highest level, significantly increased its presence in the last 24 hours. Unfortunately, 2 policemen were fatally wounded during clashes with a group of people yesterday afternoon. Following this, the National Police Commissioner visited our operations to assess the situation and lend support. Police numbers have increased further, and the intention is to increase them to between 800 and 1,000. Overnight, SAPS has been developing a strategy that is aimed at peacefully corralling the mobs of people who have been gathering daily on the property and arresting those suspected of having been involved in criminal activity. And then goes on to say, the situation was relatively peaceful overnight with no reported incidents of unrest. There is no production from the shafts. So, can you tell us, on this assessment on the 14th of August, how did you understand the position, and what did you think was necessary, if anything?
Well, my own assessment was, as Roger Phillimore was saying, that there was, in the media particularly, in the South African press, more focus on what government's actions are to restore peace on the mines, and the deployment of further police was also helpful. Overnight, he reports that it was relatively people, although 2 other people had been killed, police officers, and that to me also raised my own concern once again, because it seemed like the situation, much as it seemed peaceful at the time, was actually getting worse, because more and more people were getting injured and getting killed.
Yes. Now, if we could then turn to the email exchange of the 15th of August.
Page 14.
Page 14.
That would be exhibit, or that is already exhibit B 4.1.
Thank you, Chair. We see that you respond to Mr. Phillimore in this email on the 15th of August, and you say, "Thank you for your briefing notes. I have had some interaction with some of the role players and pen hereunder some of the discussions I have had. 1. Discussion with Minister Susan Shabangu. I called her and told her that her silence and inaction about what is happening at Lonmin was bad for her and the government. She said that she was going to issue a statement. She was going to be in Cape Town to attend a joint parliamentary session and would be back in Johannesburg later today to attend to the Lonman matter. I told her that I would also be in Cape Town and suggested that we should have a discussion and see what she needs to do. Now, perhaps I can just pause there for a moment and ask you to tell the Commission, what discussions did you have with Minister Shabangu?
The discussions I had with Minister Shabangu, who was then the Minister of Mineral Resources, was that the situation at Lonmin was deteriorating. More and more people were getting killed and injured, and that was a matter of great concern to me, because I knew how this type of situation can just escalate into more and more violence. And I was saying that we need to make sure that at the government level we sensitize people to this, so that the Minister of Police can be of assistance and deploy more police who can protect life and property.
Yes. It appears also from this summary and point 1 that you had indicated that inaction and silence was not desirable. Did you raise this matter with the Minister?
Yes, I did, because being the Minister responsible for these matters, I felt that she needed to be communicating a government view, and I have said that to her even on a number of occasions. Whenever there are mining accidents, I'm one of those who often say, Minister, people have died on the mines. You, as the Minister concerned, need to be making a statement and taking a position. It is your responsibility. And similarly, with this type of situation, I felt that she had a responsibility to be heard, because she's in a leadership position.
Yes. Now, there's also reference in this paragraph to the fact that you were both, that is, you and the Minister, were going to be in Cape Town at the same time. As far as you can recall, did you in fact see the Minister and meet with her?
Yes, I saw her very briefly in Cape Town, and more or less repeated precisely what I have just said now to her.
Yes.
And said that I'm concerned about this, and in fact I then said to her, the management at the mine have come to a point where they now are saying that they are seeing so many people being injured and being killed, and this, in their view, had now become quite criminal, where people were being targeted and being killed, and in their view, as Albert Jemison said in one of the emails he sent to me, that he now began to characterize this no longer as a labor dispute, but as a form of criminal activity.
Yes. And what was the response of the Minister, both during the phone call and at the brief meeting?
In my discussion with her, when she got to hear and understand precisely what is happening, she did say now she understands that with the number of people who are being killed almost on a daily basis, and the numbers were stacking up, she also conceded that it is no longer just a labor dispute, but now there was criminal activity involved, because why would people just be targeted like this and be killed?
Yes. Returning then to the email, Exhibit BBB 4.1, you then referenced that you had spoken to the president of the NUM and that he had said that he and Frans Beleni wanted to meet, using the language here, me and former NUM James Moklatsi, to discuss what they should do as a union going forward. He told me that the MUN had had a successful meeting where some 500 to 700 workers had stated that they wanted to work. Then you said, I will be speaking to Gwedi Mantashe, the ANC General Secretary, and suggest the ANC should intervene Did you in fact have such a discussion?
I did have a discussion with Minister Senzeni Zokwana, who was then the president of the NUM, and also had a discussion with Mr. James Motlatsi, and both had been involved as leaders of the NUM, and we felt that it would be good if there could be a discussion to see what can be done to stop further deaths in terms of either communicating with workers and all that. And when the report came that they had held a fairly good meeting with some of the workers, I felt that this was a step in the right direction.
Did you have any conversation with the ANC General Secretary or Secretary General?
To my recollection, it would have been a telephone discussion, and where both of us would have raised our concern about this. I do not have a deep recollection of the exact content or substance of a discussion with him.
Yes. And then you reference the Chamber of Mines, and you say, I will keep you updated on progress.
Yes.
On page 15 of the bundle, there is an email sent from Mr. Jamison to you.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. That is Exhibit BBB 4.2.
Thank you, Chair. Which is also sent, amongst others, to Mr. Phillimore. And it's Mr. Jamison on the 15th says, hello, Cyril. Thanks for your help so far. Thankfully, last night was relatively peaceful, as is this morning. We have had approached from NUM Eastern Platts that they would like to return to work if police can offer adequate protection. And then he says there are two areas of concern. The minister, and I think contextually this is clearly the Minister of Minerals, was on radio today saying she'd been briefed that this was a wage dispute and management and the union should sit down and sort it out. Not sure who's briefed her. We're waiting to talk to her, Roger, and although not too damaging, it's also not too helpful. I had two discussions with the DG, and in each case have characterized this as not an industrial relations issue, but civil unrest, destabilization, criminal issue that could not be resolved without political intervention and need the situation stabilized by the police army. I think on both occasions he agreed with me, and it reflected what was in our letter, but now I'm not sure. I have a call to him this morning. Now, perhaps let me pause there for a moment. Mr. Jamison, referencing the radio interview, seems to says of the minister that she was still seeing things as essentially a labour dispute rather than something which had spilled over into criminal activity. Can you tell us how this relates to your discussions with the minister, which you've conveyed? This is referring to a radio interview on the 15th.
Yes, in my discussions with her, as I recall, informed her about what was happening on the ground as the information had been given to me, and said to her, my concern was that people were being killed on a daily basis and people were being injured. And whilst one needed to address the issue of the labor demand that had been made, this actually started to discolor it because people were getting killed, and the concern, as I said earlier, was that they were being killed on a near targeted basis, that workers were being killed, security guards and the police and so on. So that is what I communicated to her.
Yes. It appears that she may...
Sorry, Chairperson, I'm sorry to interrupt my learned friend. Could these exhibits just be put up like all other exhibits so that we can follow?
should be possible is
Thank you, Chairperson.
there are exhibits already, so I take it they are available to the operator.
Thank you.
This is exhibit,
Triple B
I've said triple B 4.2.